started. Did everyone get a chance to sign in? If you didn't, if you could do that now. Oh, sorry. Okay. So this week we're talking about peripheral motor pathways. Last week we kind of did an overview of the peripheral nervous system, and now we're going to talk about the actual efferent pathways that control the muscle movements of your body. So some quick announcements. My office hours are Fridays from 10 to 11, the Academic Achievement Center in Row. Email me any questions you have. And this is a reminder that my notes are available on Husky CT. And I just wanted to re-emphasize that one document is like my comprehensive notes from the lecture videos. And then the other one is just kind of like a list of terms that I thought were important from the notes that I took. So yeah, you can find those in the folder on Husky CT. Okay, so starting off with motor pathway neurons. So motor pathways involve two neurons that run from the brain to the spinal cord, and there's the upper motor neuron, which is the brain to the ventral horn, and then the lower motor neuron is the ventral horn to the muscle. And then this is also known as the alpha motor neuron when the muscle that it's innervating is skeletal muscle. And then there are two main types of peripheral motor pathways. This is just a breakdown of the different types and then the different subtypes. So there are direct or pyramidal pathways or indirect pathways. Direct pathways always go from the motor cortex of the brain or the precentral gyrus to skeletal muscle, while the indirect pathways go from the brainstem to skeletal or smooth muscle. So within the direct pathways, you have the corticospinal or pyramidal tracts or the corticobulbar tracts. And within the corticospinal tracts, there's lateral and anterior tracts. And then in the indirect pathway, there's the vestibulospinal and the tectospinal. So I kind of just made this slide so you can keep them all organized and straight without any other details that might become more complicated. So here's an overview of the direct or pyramidal pathways. The corticospinal tract, the cell body is in the motor cortex of the brain. It travels through the cerebral peduncles of the midbrain. And then here are the two types of corticospinal tracts. The lateral one is responsible for appendicular muscles, which is your limbs. And this pathway crosses over in the pyramids of the medulla. So as you can remember from last time, we talked a lot about how damage affects like what muscles and what side of the body damage to a certain tract affects. So that's going to come into play here. So I have another slide that summarizes where crossing over occurs, but it's good to note that in the lateral tract, it crosses over in the medulla. Whereas in the anterior tract, it crosses over in the gray matter of the spinal cord. And the anterior one is responsible for axial muscles, which is like muscles in the center of your body. Then the corticobulbar tract is responsible for muscles of the face and neck, which are known as the cranial nerves. So again, the cell body is in the motor cortex, and it again travels through the cerebral peduncles of the midbrain, and it crosses over and ends in the brainstem because then it exits and controls like cranial nerves of your face. So I have a couple of these on these slides. I wanted to try to give you guys some tricks to remember things. So for the anterior corticospinal tract, You can remember that it controls the axial muscles, because A and A, and then lateral controls limbs, lateral and limbs. For the indirect pathways, these always run from the brainstem to skeletal or smooth muscle. For the vestibulospinal tract, this one is responsible for balance and posture. Something else important to note is that this tract is ipsilateral, which means that there's no crossing over. So if you had damage to one side of this pathway, it's always going to affect muscles on the same side of the body. And a way to remember this is vestibular means inner ear or balance. So like whenever I think of like if you have an ear infection, people might say that you're off balance. So that's how you can remember that one. Tectospinal tract is responsible for moving muscles of the neck. So this one starts in the brainstem and terminates in the cervical spinal cord. And this one you don't really have to worry about where it crosses over because it varies. And then this is just everything I just said on one slide when you're studying, so you can look at it and just kind of have everything in one place. And here's a breakdown of where crossing over occurs. So I already noted that, but again, for your studying, so you have it all in one place. Yeah, this was another little note on how to remember the indirect pathways. So the indirect pathways start in the brainstem, which control autonomic functions. And both of these pathways you don't really cross over. So I thought since they're autonomic functions, those might be more important functions like breathing. And so they don't have time to cross over. So that's might help you remember it. Also, the only pathway that crosses over in the spinal cord for these motor pathways is the anterior cortical spinal tract. And the way you can remember that is A is the first letter of the alphabet, so it wants to cross over closer to the muscle. The rest of them cross over in the brain. So, like I put on all my other slides, this is what I had for notes on the pathways. I suggest that you draw them out yourself when you're studying. But again, you can reference this. So it's important to note where crossing over occurs, where the neurons start and end. And yeah. Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay, cool. Now we're going to get into reflexes. So I mentioned this before. Reflexes are when the signal from the neuron doesn't go all the way up to the brain. It kind of just like synapses with a motor neuron in the spinal cord and then goes right back to the muscle. So it's when you don't even register in your brain that you're going to respond to something, which is kind of cool. So there are two types of reflexes, somatic and autonomic. Somatic reflexes involve skeletal muscle, and autonomic reflexes involve smooth muscle. So skeletal muscle, just to review, would be like your arm or anything, and then autonomic smooth muscle is like your GI tract, for example. So reflex arc, again, is responding to stimuli in the spinal cord instead of traveling to the brain, and there are 5 components. So there's first the receptor in the peripheral tissue that kind of registers the stimuli. Then there's the afferent neuron that brings that stimulus to the spinal cord. Then there's the integration center, which can either be monosynaptic or polysynaptic. Monosynaptic would mean that there's only one synapse between the afferent and efferent neuron, and polysynaptic means that there's an interneuron between the afferent and efferent neuron. Then the efferent neuron is just the motor neuron that brings the signal of the response back to the muscle, and the effector muscle is the muscle that responds to the stimulus. So here's a summary of what I just said in a diagram, so you can see like the touching the flame, the first neuron brings the signal to the spinal cord, which is the afferent neuron. Then synapses in the spinal cord, that little green neuron would be the interneuron. So this would be a polysynaptic reflex arc. And then the blue neuron is the efferent neuron, and the muscle in the arm is the effector muscle. So there are two reflex arcs that you should be familiar with. One is the patellar stretch reflex, and the second is the Golgi tendon reflex. So here's an overview of the patellar stretch reflex. Some important things to note is this is a monosynaptic reflex, so that means there's no interneuron, and this reflex is to prevent overstretching of muscle. So if you want to prevent a muscle from overstretching, this reflex kind of just initiates contraction of the muscle. Other things to note is that the afferent neuron is the femoral nerve, and then it synapses in the spinal cord, and then the efferent neuron is also the femoral nerve because it just initiates contraction in the nerve. So here's a diagram of the patellar stretch reflex. You can see that there's no interneuron and that it's just initiating contraction in the muscle. Here's my drawing for the same thing that we just went over. This one seems complicated, but I feel like it's pretty straightforward. Does anyone have any questions on the patellar stretch? Okay, cool. So just to like also show what like we're talking about, if your muscle is like stretching, so say you were going like this and stretch is initiated here, this reflex would kind of just initiate contraction. So you're not like overstretching the muscle, if that helps you visualize. Next is the Golgi tendon. So this one's polysynaptic, which means there's an interneuron. And now we're preventing overcontraction by relaxing the muscle instead of the opposite. Here, the receptors are in tendons. And the interneuron is going to prevent stimulation of the efferent neuron. So it inhibits the efferent neuron, which allows the muscle to relax. You can contrast this with the patellar stretch because the afferent neuron stimulated the efferent neuron, which stimulated contraction. Now we're inhibiting the efferent neuron and causing relaxation. So here's that as a diagram. You can note that there's an interneuron, and that interneuron is sending an IPSP to the efferent neuron, which is not allowing it to contract. And then here's the same thing drawn out. Any questions on the Golgi tendon pathway? Okay, cool. So here's the withdrawal and cross extensor reflex. So this is just kind of like a bunch of reflexes working together. the withdrawal reflex is a polysynaptic reflex that promotes flexion of a limb when you experience pain. So basically, like a bunch of neurons are used to make your body respond to a painful stimulus, and they're all a part of a reflex arc. Cross-extensor reflex is interaction between multiple interneurons to balance the body during a reflex. So this is if like the integration of multiple neurons interacted together that produced like a more cohesive reflex rather than just one neuron. So again, they're both examples of using more neurons to initiate a reflex. Now we'll get into some injuries that you guys discuss. So there are two categories. There are spinal cord injuries and brain injuries. And then this is a breakdown of the different injuries that are presented. So starting with spinal cord injuries, paralysis is dependent on location. So paralysis is from where the damage is down. The higher up an injury is, the more of the body is paralyzed. It's also dependent on where crossing over occurs. So for example, if there was damage to the lateral corticospinal tract, damage on the same side of the body as the injury would result because crossing over occurs in the brain. Whereas the anterior corticospinal tract, damage on the opposite side of the body would result because crossing over occurs in the spinal cord. And then lower motor neuron injury is due to damage of the efferent neuron. There's hypotonia, which is lack of muscle tone, and atrophy, which is when the muscle shrinks when it's not used. And then the brain injuries, there are basal nuclei disorders. Hypokinetic disorders are a loss of muscle control. And then two types of these are dyskinesia and akinesia. I don't know if I'm saying that right. But the first one is atypical or unconscious movements, and the second one is atypical unconscious body posture. So an example of this is Parkinson's disease, which is when not enough dopamine is produced because the neurons are dying. And then that leads to tremors. Another type of brain injury is cerebellar ataxia, and this is a loss of coordination caused by damage to the cerebellum. And then frontal lobe damage includes stroke, and this is from a lack of oxygen. And strokes can be a result of a clot or like loss of blood. And some symptoms of stroke may be spasticity, which is the inability to relax muscles, hemiplegia, which is paralysis to one side or another of the body, or non-fluent aphasia, which is damage to Broca's area. Okay, so now we have some practice questions. Some of these I took from Top Hat, so I don't know if you guys have done them yet. And then some of them I modified. So first one, I think this one's from Top Hat. In the Golgi tendon reflex, the synapse between the interneuron and the alpha motor neuron causes what? Does anyone know? Yeah.
Doesn't it cause an inhibition of the alpha motor neuron so that the muscle relaxes?
Yeah. So, also known as an IPSP, it's an inhibitory stimulus to prevent contraction and cause the muscle to relax. Now the opposite, in the patellar stretch reflex, synapses between the interneuron, or there's no interneuron, between the afferent neuron and the efferent neuron causes what? So I'll fix that in the slides. It should be efferent to, or afferent to efferent neuron. Yeah, no interneuron. Yeah.
Would it cause muscle contraction?
Yes. So it's an excitatory stimulus, EPSP, that would cause the muscle contraction. Next one, the Golgi tendon reflex is activated when the tendon is experiencing overstretching or overcontracting. And then the patellar reflex is activated when a muscle is experiencing overstretching or overcontracting. Does anyone have an idea? Yeah.
Overcontracting for the first one and then overstretching.
Yes. So remember, it's patellar stretch. So it's when it's overstretching and the Golgi wants to relax. I think I took this one from Top Hat too. Would a lesion to the left lateral corticospinal tract affect your ability to move your right or left foot? Does anyone want to try? Yeah. Yeah, do you know why? Yeah, exactly. So the corticospinal tract here, the lateral crosses over in the medulla. So damage to the spinal cord would affect the same side of the body. And if you were confused about what it meant by tract, this is referring to damage in the spinal cord. Would a lesion to the left lateral corticospinal tract in the brain affect your ability to move your right or left foot? So this is the same question as last time, but now we're talking about damage in the brain rather than in the spinal cord. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So since crossing over occurs in the brain, damage would affect the opposite side of the body. Would a lesion to the lower motor neuron on the right of the lateral corticospinal tract affect the ability to move your right or left leg? Does anyone know? Yeah.
It's the right,
Why?
it's the lower motor neuron doesn't.
Yes. So damage to motor neurons always occur on the same side of the body, no matter what the pathway is, because those never cross over. And that's all I have for you guys. If you have any questions, I know your exam's on Monday. Feel free to come to office hours or come ask me or email. But yeah.